Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic podcast. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and with me today is not Rod. I have a special guest, Mr. Emile Doak from the American Conservative. Emile, how you doing?
Doing great, Kale. Good to be on.
Yeah. This is a change. Rod, for those regular viewers / listeners, Rod is gallivanting, I believe, through Spain this week on a tour of his Live Not by Lies. So I decided that we would tack over here and have a conversation from you. So what's new in DC these days, Emile?
There's just nothing going on, Kale. It's
Yeah.
nothing at all.
Sleepy town.
That's right. Yeah. No, it is a fascinating time. What we do at the American Conservative is try and chart where the right's going to go in the post-Trump era. And I think that's a really open question right now. As readers of Rod's blog know, and as listeners of the podcast know, faith and culture, we hope, will be a central part of that. But what form that takes, I think, is still a live question. So there's a lot of jockeying going on right now. There's a lot of debate about where the right's going. And that's a conversation that we intend to lead at the American Conservative.
I agree. There's so much going on. One thing that strikes me just before we came on, I sort of had this thought pop into my head. It's so nice not to be in the middle of an election cycle right now. I know that changes, and and it's gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, those windows of time in which we're not doing the horse race, commenting bit. But we're not there right now, and I think this is, of course, as good a time as any for those of us conservatives, either political conservatives or social conservatives or both, to really take some time to breathe and think through, well, what is it going to be after Trump? So what kind of stuff are you chewing on and working with at tack?
Yeah, it's a great time for us at the magazine. Longtime readers, again, should know that we were founded in opposition to the Iraq War. But our mission was much broader than just that one issue. We wanted to reignite conversations we felt had been neglected by conservatives for far too long. These were surrounding things like political economy. We were much more willing to question the benefits of the free trade regime. Things like immigration. We were willing to look at the cost to communities already here of just unchecked immigration. And then on faith and culture, this is why Rod's been such an important voice at the magazine for so long. We've long felt that the social conservative leg of the three-legged stool, right? The three-legged stool fusionism that's defined American conservatism for decades now. We'd long thought that social conservative leg of the stool was getting shortchanged, basically. They were getting erratic scraps in terms of court picks who didn't always pan out, who didn't always defend our values. And that's to say nothing of the consistency or lack thereof of a sort of robust political social conservatism, Christianity, with those other two legs of the stool, with a hawkish foreign policy and what essentially amounts to free market absolutism. And so there's a huge opportunity now, I think. If you look at what Trump ran on in 2016, he repudiated a lot of that. And that gives us an opportunity, I think, to hopefully build a more holistic politics that takes into account really what we value as conservatives and as Christians.
Yeah, he was such a wrecking ball with some of those sacred cows. It was, as Rod and others, I'm sure in the magazine, have sort of quipped over the years, as a kind of zombie Reaganism that seemed to never quite be ever willing to be put down. That what got short shrift in all of those sort of return to those sort of repeated talking points over and over again really just kind of got stale and played out. As you reflect on the previous administration, and as we're in the middle of a very new and very different administration, how much of Trump's personality do you think crowded out some of these green shoots in conservatism?
I think that's the $1 million question. I always wonder what percent of Trump's appeal was the personality and what percent was these distinct positions on issues that I just outlined. I like to think that a lot of the appeal was the issues. And I still do think that there is a big appetite out there for a new a new direction on those issues on the right. There's a political realignment happening. I think that's undeniable. But I do think that Trump's personality, for all his flaws, really did draw a lot of the country. That sort of combativeness, the vulgar tweets and all that, which I may not have liked, I think that was appealing to huge swaths of the country. And that's something that we need to grapple with if we want to create a coalition that can actually win. Is it going to be doable with a very polished politician? We'll find out. But Trump seemed to have that sort of that special coalition to put the two together and win.
I think about this, quite a bit. I have two sort of questions for you as someone who's been watching the political scene and the conservative political scene. I mean, you grew up right outside of D.C.
Virginia side, I have to say. I have to clarify.
Yeah, you have to add that. That's right, not the Maryland side. Yeah, but so it was basically, one of your team sports, I would imagine, on some level, just growing up and watching it all happen. Were you surprised at what Trump, clearly Trump cracked the brains of CNN and MSNBC and those people that you would expect him to have had a sort of a negative effect upon. Were you surprised at all, are you surprised at all at the way in which he cracked sort of conservative ink? Like even today, and I follow all of these various people on Twitter, and he's still living rent-free in their heads.
I think this has been coming for a long time. Bob Mary, our former editor, remarked, it was right after the 2016 election, that the real divide was no longer right versus left. It was nationalist versus globalist. And this isn't unique just to Bob. I mean, a lot of people have said this. David Goodhart had a book in around 2017, I think, that charted this divide between the anywheres and the somewheres. Right? The main thing driving our politics is between people whose identities come from their place. They feel like they're connected to somewhere, and those who are at home anywhere. They're part of the global ruling class. And that transcends right versus left. So I think this had all been bubbling under the surface for a very long time. The most committed voters in the Republican Party look a lot more like the Trump voter than they do the Fairfax County, suburban voter who have now largely gone over to the left. When I was growing up in Fairfax County, I think it went for Bush. Definitely Loudoun County did. So this used to be much more of a Republican area. And now, it's, of course, overwhelmingly Democratic. That just speaks to this realignment that's going on right now and the way that these parties are shifting.
It's interesting you say that. I hear that, I read, I guess as the title of the podcast would suggest, I try to do a decent amount of eclectic reading and eclectic listening. And, you say that there's a realignment happening and that it's no longer sort of that traditional way, at least what you and I grew up with, the left and the right. And I can't tell you how even people who are not part of what were traditionally considered sort of conservative types, they're sort of saying the same thing. I'll hear people who were traditionally leftists or even progressives say, and I don't even know if these categories, apply anymore. Like, what does it mean to be a leftist? What does it mean to be right wing now? It seems to be very, very different.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. I welcome that to some extent. I mean, this goes back to the consensus, but that vision of the Republican Party as the sort of country club party of the wealthy and of Wall Street, and then you throw in sort of Christian cultural conservatives onto that. I don't think that was ever consistent. I don't think that was viable in the long term. Right. Perhaps in the 1980s, when we had different challenges, that was a coalition of convenience that could work. We're long past that now. And that's, again, one thing that I really want us to be working on in the American Conservative is what is an authentically conservative response to the problems that we face now. Not the problems we faced 20, 30, 40 years ago, but to what we're facing right now. And I think that's why there's an opportunity to rethink this. And yeah, these lines are shifting. What it meant to be a conservative then isn't what it means now. I do think that there is a core, though, that we can go back to. It's stuff that you talk about on this podcast all the time. The principles that should drive an authentic conservatism are actual principles. For far too long, we've supplanted that with policies, right? To be a principled conservative means that you support a strong national defense and free markets, and the like. And to me, those are policies. Should we put a tariff on goods coming from China? That's a policy question. That's not a principle question. What we should be looking at is whether those policies actually conserve the principles that make life worthwhile. Faith, family, country, culture. And so that, I think, can get us to a much more productive conversation about what are the policies that conservatives should ascribe to conserve those principles that you and Rod talk about all the time.
So you're talking about, you see the divide probably lining up more along the lines of sort of like a localism versus a globalism. Am I saying that correctly? Why does localism, or I guess maybe nationalism, scare people? Why does that idea scare the people who are more comfortable in what you sort of described as sort of the globalist
Well, I think first of all, there's a really important distinction between localism and nationalism, which we can get into as well.
Okay, good. That's
but
that's
important,
do it. Yeah,
right? Because I get the criticism of nationalism, right? If you look throughout history, it can become a sort of blood and soil, for lack of a better term, scary thing and all that.
Yeah, right, of course.
I do think though that the problems with nationalism, in my view, is that it becomes an abstraction, right? We should want to root ourselves in things that are concrete in relationships and other people. That's how we make this more humane and avoid some of the more nefarious strands of nationalism. But those same problems are exacerbated even more by globalism. That's even more abstract. That's even more removed from the concrete relationships that make life worthwhile. So to the extent that nationalism pushes back against the abstractions of globalism and brings us back into what I like to call like an anthropologically sound vision of human life, right? Like we all live in communities. So to the extent that nationalism can do that against globalism, I'm all for that. But that's why I'm only, maybe 90% of the way there on this. I think back to the National Conservatism Conference, this big conference here in D.C. Yoram Hazony, the author of The Virtue of Nationalism, good friend of our magazine, put that conference on. It was really just reclaiming nationalism as a good thing for the right. And it was a brilliant conference, loved every bit of it. My favorite speech came from Patrick Deneen. He was a professor of mine at Georgetown, so he's very much shaped my intellectual thought. But
You anticipated one of my questions. I was going to ask you what was your intellectual
it's
lineage?
very
Anyway, we'll go back to Deneen. So that's great.
My experience there. You used to be able to get a good education at Georgetown once upon a time. It's crazy. That's right. Well, not
once upon a time.
But no, his point was that he was only a little bit of the way there on nationalism because it can also iron out those local particularities that are really what get us rooted into community, right? So we feel American through our local communities. I think that's how it has to be. Otherwise, even our American nationalism becomes an abstraction and is divorced from, actually being rooted in community.
Mm-hmm. I have a sort of an oddball question here. What role does technology have in warping senses of nationalism and localism and globalism?
That's a great question. I don't know if you saw, Ross Douthat had an excellent column on the role of tech in American society, but also thinking of the right. You can even call it maybe the post-liberal right if you want. And he separated into techno-optimists and techno-pessimists.
Yeah, that's so great. I think that's rich. I think that's a rich line
of inquiry.
It was
excellent because this is something I've been grappling with for a long time. And if you look at where the American conservative fits into this, he specifically put people like Rod, people like Patrick Deneen on the post-liberal right, but also techno-pessimist versus a lot of the Silicon Valley crowd, the Claremont Institute, that whole other sort of realm of the new right. A lot of people, again, we're friendly with all those guys. They're doing great work. But I do think on this question of technology, there is a divide here. And I'm much more of a techno-pessimist. I think that what we're facing now in terms of smartphones and the internet is categorically different from things like the Industrial Revolution. I mean, what these phones are doing, what these algorithms are designed to do is, again, this comes back to a sense of anthropology. In my view, it is divorced from a Christian anthropology. They are trying to make human beings into consumers, and I think it's really hard to square that circle.
Well, what's so fascinating to me, I know, as my listeners know, I think I'm a high school teacher, and so I watch my kids interact how shall I phrase this? I watch my kids serve their phones and their apps all the time. I myself am I'm a gadget. I'm embarrassed every Sunday morning when my iPhone reminds me how many hours I spend on it.
No, I'm right there with you.
I am. I know on some. Yeah, I know I'm on some level throwing rocks from glass houses, but I do think and maybe this is a little lie that I tell myself, but I do think that it's important to understand that the phone is programming you, and that we do have power and agency, but only if we recognize that the phone is serving an algorithm, and therefore I'm serving an algorithm because it's just taking all of me, all of my stuff, all of my data, all of my attention, right? It's taking that and monetizing it for somebody else. And so I know that, and you know that, and I think maybe that's part about being an adult. An adult should know that, but I worry so much about my students because they do not think it's weird, and I'm not being hyperbolic here. They do not think it's weird that some of them watch TikTok for 5 hours on a Saturday.
I don't know if
they don't think that's weird.
Yeah.
I mean, they'll joke about it a little bit. And some of them are more than 5 hours a day. That's on one app. And you so as the adult, you're still like, okay, guys, how can you not, you need to have some kind of perspective on this. This is not normal behavior. And they just sort of smile and like, oh, Mr. Zeldin, the resident old fogey, which is true. But I mean, it's an astounding amount of time
I don't know if you know
that we
this.
serve our phone.
I'm a former teacher myself. Not anything as high-minded as
no, I did not know
what
that.
You're teaching. I was in the not so glamorous world of test prep for a couple years. But I saw the same thing. And I did this right after college. So I was only 4 years removed from my own high school experience. Right. And it was wildly different. I mean, I graduated high school in 2010, right? And at that point, we didn't quite have smartphones. Social media was just becoming a thing. And 4 years later, every student had one of these. And it was such a chore to get them off of it.
That's correct.
And that, I think, is why, to me, the Benedict option is so necessary. I mean, I have 2 young girls now. And I'm thinking about how I'm gonna, raise them to not be addicted to this thing. I mean, first of all, just don't give your kid a smartphone. Like that's so easy. But they're gonna be surrounded by it, and so you have to take steps to strategically retreat and raise them intentionally counterculturally, and that's what we have to do.
Yeah, you bring that up in that piece you wrote for Crisis. Where you talk about the compatibility between sort of the school of engagement versus the school of strategic retreat. And I wonder if you could sort of tease that out a little bit more first, and then we can maybe do that in the context of the whole
it's really,
smartphone thing.
I was thinking a lot about where the right was going and the stuff that Rod had written and things like that. And it became clear to me that in this whole conversation about moving on from the dead consensus, right, and whether or not fusionism has failed and all this stuff, there seem to be 2 schools of thought sort of forming on this. And I roughly term them the retreat position and the engage position. The retreat position is the Benedict option, right? But it's not just Rod. There were 3 books written in 2017, Tony Esolen, Archbishop Charles Chaput, and then Rod's Benedict option, which all sort of were grappling with an unease with American liberalism and saying that maybe we need to reimagine how we engage with liberal society. And so that's one answer, right? Is we need to strategically retreat. But then you have a sort of a more muscular conservatism, a more muscular post-liberal conservatism, represented by people like Sohrab Ahmari, Gladden Pappin, perhaps even J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley could fit into that. And that's seems diametrically opposed, right? Let's seize the levers of power and reorient it towards the common good. It seems like it's completely opposed to a strategic retreat. Mm-hmm. I actually think that these are completely complementary. They're both just simply addressing the perhaps you wouldn't go so far to say as liberalism's failed with Patrick Deneen, but they're addressing an unease with liberalism, and they're responding to that in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's certainly safe to say liberalism's failures, right? I mean, we can get specific and granular about the failures; they're pretty obvious. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I remember, and I don't want to, even though I talk to Rod all the time and we speak publicly here once a week. I don't think Rod sees them as at odds with one another either. Um, you know, uh, it's interesting to listen to Rod in this trip. He's been in Budapest now for a month and a half, I guess. And him just sort of talking on to people on the ground has been, I think, really illuminating to him. But I think what has been, and he said this on the podcast, but it's so fascinating to go away and look at home from afar and to afford yourself of that opportunity to sort of see a little bit more clearly, maybe a little bit less noise and maybe a little bit more signal comes through, to use that metaphor. But I think that the unease that you might have with Sarab or Gladden or some of these guys about sort of taking the levers of power and trying to be a little bit more of a robust presence in the commons, the public square. Sorry. I think that there's something to that, and I just say this before you can jump in. I literally woke up this morning, and for some reason it popped right into my head. I don't know. I'm sure you follow Sarab on Twitter, but every couple of days he'll retweet some atrocious, gross thing in the culture. If it's a little girl twerking, or if it's drag queen story hour, one of these absurd things that is all over the place, and he'll just simply say the blessings of liberty. And every time he does it, it cracks me up, because it's true. You sit here and it's like we can't afford to pretend that we live in a neutral public square. We just don't.
Well, I just don't even think there's anything. There's no such thing as a neutral public square.
Yeah.
I mean, there will always be some conception of the good enshrined in law. And then the question becomes, what conception of the good?
Yeah.
Sorab recently had a piece, I think it was in The Spectator, where his sort of evidence for why these aren't the blessings of liberty is just look around you. Right? He says that a lot. Just look around you. And I think it's becoming hard to reject the fact that this is a thoroughly anti-Christian in many ways culture. And then the question becomes, what do you do?
What do you
right?
do?
And that's where I think that these two retreat and engage positions are complementary.
Good.
I went to public school. I met my wife at public school. It was fantastic. I would love to send my kids to our public school that we went to. We still live in our hometown. It would be possible.
Yeah.
I don't think even 10 years later that we could do that. I think this gender ideology has just so taken over. When I was there, I don't want to get my former teacher in trouble, but we had a teacher there at my high school in 2008. He was handing out bumper stickers that said "Real men marry women."
Wow.
He's a conservative guy.
Can you imagine that today? I mean, honestly, there's no way. Absolutely no way.
He'd be fired in a heartbeat. I mean, that Tanner Cross, that teacher out in Loudoun County, was fired just for pushing back on gender ideology at a public meeting, right? Well,
look, the Gramscian march through the institutions certainly proceeds apace, but in education, it is a total capture and rout, and I have to tell you, Emile, it continually amazes me that people on sort of who are basically sympathetic to what you and I talk about and write about, are still in this mode of pretending like it's not that bad. And what are they paying attention to? I don't get it.
Well, you see this firsthand, right?
I do.
How are things at school, Kale?
Yeah. Well, look, I'm very fortunate. I work at a place, a mission-driven Catholic institution that is serious about its mission. And look, we're a mainstream place, and it's not like we certainly don't exist in some sort of alt world. But man, it's tough. I mean, we live in a thoroughly secularized and implicitly anti-Christian culture. And our kids come out of that. Even those kids who come to us, from quote unquote Catholic or Christian families, they have no idea how they've been programmed by their algorithms, and that's really what I mean by the problem of the technology, right? The problem of the technology is that it is constantly teaching and instructing and informing our kids, and it's happening right under our noses. And what they're selling is really powerful and palpable, not so much because I believe it's true, but it's because they've been able to isolate certain half-truths, play on people's empathy and compassion in such a way that they have captured the minds and the hearts of our children. I mean, really, and I don't want to be, totally. Well, yes, I do. It's bad. I really do think it's bad. I wouldn't be doing this podcast with Rod once a week and doing the kind of things that I want to talk about if I didn't think it were that bad. Honestly, I would much prefer to sit and hear and teach Dante and and Paradise Lost and what I get to teach. I'd much prefer to do that all the time. But I really think it's gotten to the point where people just do not seem to fully or even at all comprehend how serious it is. And I deliberately invoke Gramsci because I do think that it is. I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this podcast just said, look, basically Mao made Gramsci, Mao brought Gramsci into the real. And I believe in some real way we're living in a kind of Maoist moment, a kind of cultural revolutionary moment, where we're going to, where the forces are sort of actively going against the four olds and all of that. And I see kids turning against parents, kids turning against institutions, and all of that. I see it. It's look, we're not that far removed from last summer,
Yeah, the split between students and parents, I think, is especially concerning. There was that report, I can't remember exactly what it was, about, I think it was a Middle Eastern immigrant whose child basically he started receiving reports about his daughter, and of course it was his son, but they just diagnosed him with gender dysphoria, and he was like, what do I do? That to me is really it's how you see how pernicious this stuff is when you're turning children against their own parents.
Are you referring to the City Journal piece by Shire out in the state of Washington?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Truly, I'll put, you'll see under the show right now the link to that piece, an amazingly eye-opening piece. I mean, you talk about state encroachment over the sovereignty of the family. I mean, that is an astounding piece that the state just did it, right? And I mean, that's where, how can you not stand in some sort of frightened awe of the power of the state to do something like that? They can take your own child and start calling your son a daughter. It really is scary stuff. But and it's happening, right?
It totally is.
You and I are not being reactive. It's actually happening.
I think it's also an indictment, though, on the conservative movement. I mean, religious liberty is not enough. Ryan Anderson, who's now president of EPPC, had a great piece on that when he took over there. And the problem is that for a long time, the right and Republicans have simply said, give me my religious liberty and we'll be fine.
Sure.
Especially post-Obergefell, right? Overnight, it just flipped from we support traditional marriage to we support religious liberty. And we're seeing the problems with that right now. I mean, there are always going to be limits to religious liberty. There always have been throughout American history. That's well documented. So if the left is able to say that this child's right to live their true identity is vital to their mental health, that's going to trump your religious liberty. So we need to be prepared to make actual arguments for what we believe and why what we believe is not crazy, is not backwards, is not bigoted. And until we're able to do that, I think we're going to continue to lose on these things because there is an internal logic there that says that your religious liberty has limits, and those limits come right up to identity politics, which has now become our civil religion.
Yeah, it is our religion. So so you're talking about a kind of conservatives have privileged a sort of focus on proceduralism, right? That the procedures of law, et cetera, would sort of safeguard things. But clearly that's not enough. I mean, and it's interesting that you said Ryan T. Anderson is talking about this, because what struck me so much about the, gosh, it seems like it's decades and decades ago, but it wasn't even a decade ago, I think, when Obergefell came
Only
down.
6 years ago, which is astonishing.
6 years ago. I mean, it really is astonishing. I mean, it really is amazing. But, you look at something like Anderson or Robbie George and these guys, they wrote this really pretty amazing book, on sort of using just natural law arguments about why marriage, should be between a man and a woman. And it was just completely ignored. Like, it didn't even matter. It's like, it's a good book, but it's like, just, it didn't matter. Like, it was not compelling in the least bit in terms of the public conversation. And so I think it was at that point where I started to see maybe this sort of proceduralism is not going to be enough. I think I was like, well, we're going to need something a little bit more robust. What do you make of, we're about a year plus removed from the Sarab's sort of throwdown with David French. And I remember when that happened.
I thought it just went without anyone noticing at all. But
yeah. Well, it's so interesting to me. Like, I remember when the fight sort of first blew up, and I remember being like, "Ooh, man, this is sort of unseemly. I'm not used to this level of sort of intertent pugilism." But here it is, and I remember thinking at the time, I'm not sure what I think about this, but I think it's really important. And I still think it's really important, and I still don't fully know what I think about it. But I do know that I continue to read Sarab's work, and I continue to read David French's work, and I'm just really surprised at the sort of the stark difference. I mean, if I would have read something from David French 6 years ago, I would have been like, yeah, that's great. Like, I'm down with that. That sounds good to me. And now I read it, and I just sort of scratch my head a little bit and thinking like, man, I just don't think he gets it, like, at all.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think.
Is it okay for me to go this way? I don't want to put you in hot water.
No, this is the conversation right now on the right.
Yeah.
I think it's tough because I think that David French has done excellent work defending religious liberty, defending the rights of religious conservatives. But this gets back to what you were saying before about the proceduralism, right? I mean, that stuff is very necessary. And I'm not saying we abandon that. People at ADF are doing great work. They should continue doing that. But if we're talking about the broader conversation of where the right needs to go, I think that's a relic of a past age that wasn't so thoroughly oriented against us. I think that we should be unashamed to say that drag queen story hour is demonic and should be abolished immediately. Like, let's ban that. Like Sarab said many times, I'm willing to ban things. We should be more willing to ban things. We have a vision of the good that is directly competing with a lot of what the cultural left is putting out. And if we truly believe that our vision is better, is true, it's not just my truth, that's a completely ridiculous statement. It is true, capital T true. We should be unafraid to both defend it and defend it in policy and in law. I think, one of Sarab's huge strengths is intuiting where the conversation is going and for moving that conversation down the field. And that essay certainly did it in his own provocative way. But I think in the time since, it's only borne out how necessary that conversation was. And really why we need to be more muscular and less procedural.
It sort of dovetails a little bit with my earlier question to you about what the Trump thing exposed, in terms of conservative ink and, establishment conservatism and all of that. And I don't live in DC. I've never lived in DC. I've had family that have lived in DC for a long time. So I've been a bunch, but I've never been in part of that Beltway culture. But I'm shocked at how tone deaf some of them remain. Especially as regards these sort of cultural issues, these things that ultimately matter. I know that the tax code matters, and and I know all that stuff, and I know that foreign policy matters, and all that. But in terms of the stuff that really matters to me, my kids and my family and my community, I'm just really surprised how little those sort of national figures seem to pay attention to those.
Well, they have different priorities, different values, right? I mean, what we do with the American conservatives, trying to be a voice for Main Street conservatives in D.C. You mentioned foreign policy. I think that's a great example of this. The military-industrial complex is real. And you can just look at Northern Virginia. Yeah. I mean, there are a ton of military contractors near where I grew up whose livelihoods depend on continuing these wars. They're not necessarily the ones who are sending the best and brightest in their communities to go fight them for 20 years and currently have children of soldiers who were fighting there 20 years ago who are not fighting in those same wars. But they do have an incentive to keep these wars going because they need a paycheck too. And it's good for business in the military contracting community if we have conflicts to fight. So I think there's a fundamental disconnect between the values and the incentives of Main Street, of Middle America, and what you see in this town, which is solely based on sort of perpetuating this political class.
So how'd you get into all this, Emile? I mean, how'd you find yourself in this, sort of neck of the woods, so to speak? I mean, we mentioned that you grew up in Herndon, right, Virginia, which is about half hour outside of D.C.
I always like to cite the traffic time,
which
is about an hour, and it makes it sound like we are way farther out than we actually are.
Well, I've been to D.C. recently, and an hour traffic is like 10 miles now. So, yes. I that doesn't quite do it justice. But I mean, how'd you get into all of this? I mean, this side of conservatism. I mean, did you start off as a conservative? Did you read yourself into this direction? I mean, how'd you wind up here at the American Conservative?
Pure luck. But no,
blessings.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, who knows what God was thinking. No, I mean, I was always sort of dispositionally conservative, and it just came from just liking this country and liking my community, and I kind of felt that conservatives sort of have this reflexive patriotism, right? And I was attracted to that.
But you would be accused right now of, don't tell me I'm not a patriot. Don't tell me I'm not a patriot. I love the federal government. I love
yes, right.
Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
I went to Georgetown to study politics, and through a number of great professors. I mentioned Patrick Deneen, Josh Mitchell, who's written a great new book on identity politics. I was one of my professors there as well. Father Shaw, the late Father Shaw, who was incredible. Yeah. Father Stephen Fields in theology. So I had an excellent education there that made me sort of rethink a lot of these things. I was very, for these military interventions at that point because I just hadn't really thought much about it. Right. I was very reflexively, free market's great. I still think the free market's great. I just think that there are limits to these things. And so I'm very fortunate that I had a great education there. Started reading the American Conservative. Everyone should read the American. Become a member today for $60. You can read great stuff. That's right. So I sort of saw that what I cared about was not necessarily being conserved by the official conservative movement, and we needed a new politics.
Did you flirt with abandoning the conservative project altogether because you weren't seeing enough voices sort of at the levers of control of Conservative Inc.? Or I mean, how did that play itself out? I mean, how did you not just get totally disgusted by the whole thing? I guess.
Well, I did, and that's why I taught. I did the internship game throughout college. I wanted to work in that world, and I was just so disillusioned that I wanted to do what you're doing, Kale. I wanted to go teach for a Catholic school somewhere, and just have that be my life. Again, who knows if it was God's providence or whatever, but I got into test prep, which is not a very rewarding field of education to be in. It's a lot of parents who want to pay a lot of money to get their kids in schools they don't belong in.
It's mercenary business, man. It's pure and it's mercenary. It's pure.
That is very true. There's nothing hidden about it.
But very transactional, of course.
Yes. But yeah, and this was right about the Trump era, and I just found that fascinating that this vulgar sort of New York businessman who seemed to personally represent so many things that I abhorred as a conservative, but yet was channeling a lot of the message that I felt conservatives needed, and was resonating with a lot of people too. I found that fascinating, and I was like, I need to get back into this. There's a huge opportunity here to move the right in a different direction, and so that's what I did. So
That's great. That's great. Yeah, it's funny. I've been thinking about, I'm Catholic, and I know you're Catholic too, and I sort of tend to think of these various areas in my life, my sort of intellectual life and like sort of my political life, I suppose, and my faith life. I mean, I know they're all of a piece, but you sort of think of these various things and the institutions that are associated with all those various impulses or forces in your life. And I've been thinking a lot about Catholicism and the corruption of our own institutional church that we can see pretty much on full display pretty much every day. And I've been thinking about, this is a roundabout way, I'm getting there, I promise. But I've been thinking about, my understanding of fusionism, right, from a conservative standpoint. Like, what was that project, and was there an original sort of good in fusionism? And I guess, to me, the mascot for fusionism in my own brain has been Buckley, right? And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn necessarily to say that. But what did Buckley do? And because there were some good things in that work that he did, and I think in a big way he chased out a lot of the sort of the weirdos, the conspiracy theorists, and the sort of the anti-Semitism and the racism, all those sorts of things. He sort of made it a no-go zone for those darker impulses on the human psyche. And so I wonder, as I explore the online world of traditional and conservative Catholicism, I see a lot of the same kind of weirdness and crankiness and conspiratorial thinking. And, I wonder if we're due up for some sort of, again, it's not going to be fusionism, but it's that same kind of project of kind of cleansing the sort of this nasty element in Catholicism. I don't know if you've given that sort of stuff any thought or not.
Are you a cradle Catholic, Kale?
I am. Yeah, I am. I was raised Catholic. I grew up in New Orleans, and then we moved to Baton Rouge when I was 10. And, Baton Rouge and New Orleans are pretty Catholic places, certainly atypical of the South in general, whereas the South in general tends to be more, Protestant and evangelical. New Orleans is very Catholic, and in the Baton Rouge that I grew up was very Catholic as well. But, I sort of threw a hissy fit toward the end of my high school career, and I kind of histrionically left the church and thought I was an agnostic and all of that. So then I started to read, and then I read my way back into the church. So by the time I was around 20 years old, I was sort of back, if you will, but really there for the first time. Yeah, well, I was a voracious reader. And I realized, in really a real blessing. I mean, I've had some good people in my life. My older brother, my parents are all of them have a sort of an intellectual bent, and that was important to me. And I had some good teachers, the same kind of thing. And I read a soul book that was amazing, and that really shattered my paradigm, my political paradigm. And then I read C.S. Lewis, and that shattered my kind of intellectual literary paradigm. So very helpful stuff. But so anyway, why do you ask if I was a cradle Catholic?
No, I'm just curious. I'm a convert. I converted when I was in college.
Got it.
Basically from nothing. I wasn't raised in any faith.
Just a good old-fashioned NONE, or?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Just good old-fashioned none.
Yeah.
I sort of read my way into it, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it's the convert's enthusiasm, although that was still years ago, and I'm not at all blinded by the failures of the church.
Sure.
I'm not as concerned about the more conspiratorial elements of it. I think it was Ross Douthat, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was him who had this column basically saying that we need to pay attention to the sort of kooky voices. Right?
I think about that line all the time. He's like,
I do too.
Yeah, that weird dude who waits for an hour at the back of the line to talk to you after one of your talks, and he says something. Oh, there's something going on with McCarrick or whatever it was, and I always remember that line because I think there's a real truth to that. So fair enough. I do think that is true. So yeah, I'm not trying to paint in any kind of, I'm not trying to, throw bleach all over everything because I think that stuff needs to sort of come out. But I also think that, the institutional church's failures have only electrified some of those more conspiratorial elements in the church. And I get it. Look, I mean, I can get myself into a pretty dark place pretty quickly about things. But, but some of the Trumpian parts of that fringe, it's pretty nuts.
Oh yeah, I mean, look, I'm dispositionally sort of just viscerally dispositionally like opposed to a lot of that stuff. I'm just not there. But I take Ross's point to heart that a lot of times these people are more right than they may seem. But the broader thing to me is, and maybe this is just ignorance, but I try not to worry too much about church politics. Try not to follow it that much. Look, there's a lot of bad things in the church. It's a human. It's a divine institution made up of humans, and there's always going to be sin in the church. But I am convinced that it is the one true church founded by our Lord, and the gates of hell will never prevail against it. And I'm convinced that that's true. So I don't, in my own life, I don't think that it does my faith any good to get too, caught up in the Cardinal Marx thing and the latest off the cuff comment that Pope Francis says that might seem wild, and a lot of these scandals, because I am simply convinced that the gates of hell will not prevail, and this is Christ's church, and that's for better or for worse what we got. It's the method of salvation.
I take that to heart. I mean, I think that it's probably true. I think it's probably better to have a kind of a gauzy-eyed view of what's going on over there. But I do want to connect it to an earlier point that you and I were talking about, which is, that it's very easy to become distracted by the goings on, at the Capitol, so to speak, or Rome or whatever it is, and forget that you're actually embedded in a community, you're embedded in a parish, you're embedded in a local space, and it kind of doesn't matter what is sort of set off the cuff in a flight, in an Alitalia flight from Rome to London. It's like you can focus so much on that stuff, and you can forget that you actually have to pay attention to what's right next to you. And I have to tell myself that quite a bit. And the sad part, of course, Emile, is that this makes it really easy to distract myself by the goings-on of things in far-flung capitals around the globe and not pay attention to my family, not pay attention to my students, not pay attention to my community.
I think that's
a temptation.
I think it's exactly right. I'm much more concerned about what goes on in my own parish in Virginia than I am what goes on at the Vatican. I think that has much more of an impact on my own spiritual life than anything that goes on there. And I do think that this was partly why the church has been able to survive and have many, many saints throughout the millennia with very, very bad popes and very corrupt Vaticans, is that people live locally. We've sort of had a celebrityification. I don't even know if that's a word, but we have made the Pope into a celebrity. I think this started at least with JP2, who, look, I love JP2 as a saint and everything.
Yeah, me too.
But that was a sort of departure from the norm, where suddenly the Pope became this international figure who jetted around and became one of the most famous people in the world. I think that's actually pretty problematic. And I think there's an element of clericalism to this, that we hold our clergy up on a pedestal at varying degrees, right? Like parochial vicar and then pastor and then bishop, and they're supposed to be holier throughout. And that's what makes it really tough when you see things like the McCarrick scandal, because you think, oh my goodness, this was supposed to be a cardinal of the church. They were supposed to be super holy. That's not how it works. If anything, the devil probably targets those people even more, and they're even under more attack. So we shouldn't necessarily be surprised, and we should pay attention to the local, because that has much more of an impact on your day-to-day life.
Yeah, no, I find that basically compelling too. I two things on that. Number one, I think that the church has played a role in that sort of superheroification. I think that's how you said it of our bishop. Yeah, well, you know why not? It's late in the hour here. So, but of making sort of superstar priests and superstar bishops and cardinals and popes and all of that. I think that the church would probably do better to sort of pull back a little bit from that kind of thing. But can you imagine Avignon, the Avignon scandal, if Twitter existed? I mean, can you imagine? I one of the podcasts that I like to listen to is the Tom Holland, Dominic Sandbrook podcast called "The Rest Is History," and they say that, can you imagine Luther with Twitter? Because Luther would have wrecked everything a lot quicker if he would have had that kind of power. But that's it's always interesting to watch these crises that are in part accelerated and captured by technological advances. Luther is Luther in so much and was so effective in part because he had technology on his side, a new technology, a novel technology, that nobody quite knew what to do with it, nor the effects that it was going to have. And I think that we're trying to sort this out right now, aren't we? I mean, this is one of Rod's points in Live Not by Lies, is that our technology, this art now come upon us fully, soft totalitarianism, that the powers that be at Twitter and Facebook and Google and Microsoft, they effectively have more power than the government in certain spheres. And I don't think we have fully wrapped our heads around the implications of that.
And we've just acquiesced to it as well. I mean, you have lawmakers who are going to Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg and asking them to do certain things. Like, if you're a member of Congress, I mean, just you have the power over these people purportedly. So it is completely
allegedly. Allegedly.
Yeah, exactly.
It's pretty amazing to watch. I mean, we'll see, that we need to sort of do a rethink in terms of what the Bill of Rights means, for God's sakes. Our jurisprudence just doesn't seem to have caught up with the technological advances. So it'll be interesting to watch how that shakes down. I mean, I still, we're several months now removed from Trump, and I'm still blown away by the fact that a couple of companies decided to just shut down his access to social media. Like, no big deal. Just, what do we call the president all the time? The most powerful man in the world. Really? Doesn't seem like he's the most powerful man in the world to me, because he can't even, send out a tweet, as stupid as some of those tweets are, right? I mean, it's really a remarkable thing, and nobody's really talking about it. Just like, I think
it's absolutely right. Like, we need to pause and reflect on the fact that a private company took away the leader of this country's ability to communicate.
Right.
Like, that is astonishing. That's where we're at. And also, the bigger thing is that it's not a bigger story. Like, we just sort of brushed it aside.
No, it's amazing. Of course, the story's not done yet. But man, it really is. It's kind of a big collective shrug, and I think in part that's because that the legacy media, the mainstream media, had gotten themselves so torqued up and worked up into an hourly, by the quarter hour fit about everything that was going on, and that I think that they're just, maybe everybody's just sort of taking a breather right now. But meanwhile, history proceeds apace, and there are things of consequence going on all around us. I mean, so and we didn't even get into. I'll spare you a conversation about the G7, but I bet you have opinions about that.
Spaced photo, I think, is all that our viewers and listeners need to see to know how that went. And the stage fist bumps or elbow bumps for the camera.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems so awkwardly European. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think that same thing happens if it were to happen, in the United States. Those sort of strange, it's like, what is it? What is it? Is it Eurovision? It seems so Eurovision to me,
right.
and I think hopefully Americans would mock it if anything like that were to happen here. So at any rate. All right. Well, look, we're at the top of the hour. Emile, you did a full hour with us.
The poor man's Rod Dreher doing
thank you.
my best impression.
No, this
I have
has been
the glasses,
great.
but I don't have the hair.
Yeah.
So
no, I know we can't
right.
all do that. But for him, I'll go ahead and send us out. Don't get nothing on you.
Thanks, Kale.
Take care.